Christiana Figueres, it's a great honour to interview you for my book. Thank you for having me in your home in London, your new home.
Yes, my soon-to-be home, my being yet made my home.
Well, it's lovely to see you here in London. I've seen you over the years at the head of COPs, including the wonderful Paris Climate Agreement, and here you are in your new guise. And I'd love to talk to you in the interview about what you're doing now. But
Okay.
I wanted to begin by asking you to tell my listeners something about your career and where it all began and what you're doing.
So like Julie Andrews would sing, let's start at the very beginning, right?
Very good.
So where do I come from? I believe I come from a very wonderful family. A family where my father was 3 times president of Costa Rica. My brother has been once president, and I rather suspect that he's looking at it again. We shall see. Crystal ball. But more, and my mother was also very active in politics. But I think what marks my family is a true commitment to service, and I think that is the mother's milk that we got from my mother and the blood that runs in our veins from my father was very much the commitment that because we have been extraordinarily privileged in the education that we have all received, that the duty that comes with that privilege is to use that education and whatever head we have on our shoulders in the service of others. And in particular, I think the message that they really inculcated to us is that the definition of who that others means, and has always meant those who are less privileged. In my father's, who is, I think, the one who has marked me the most, in my father's language, because he worked very much within the national context in Costa Rica, having been the father of the revolution and the person who outlawed the army and created modern Costa Rica, but he was very, very adamant about the fact that his life was devoted to the well-being of the majority of the people, i.e. the bottom of the pyramid. And the way that I have translated that message, because I've chosen to work at a different level, so I don't work at the Costa Rican national level anymore, I used to, but I've now chosen to work at the global level, and the way I have translated that message is the work that I do really is to protect the most vulnerable from the impacts of climate change. Because it's very clear that climate change is the worst threat that humanity is facing, and it's also very clear that there's a deep, deep, deep injustice about it. Those who have absolutely no responsibility, neither in the past nor in the present, not even in the future, they are exempt from any responsibility because they have never emitted, they are not emitting, and they will probably not emit in any substantial way. But those are the ones who are most vulnerable. And those are the ones who are most impacted. And, you know, I think what we just saw in Haiti a few months ago is a very vivid example. That entire island is the one and only least developed country in Latin America, has been hit constantly by all kinds of disasters, national, political and natural. But those natural disasters, such as the hurricane that they just experienced, is augmented. It's not caused by climate change, but it is certainly augmented by climate change. And with respect to climate change, they have absolutely no responsibility in the past, present, or future. And yet, they have to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild. So if we do not address climate change in a timely fashion, and I really want to talk about that because the timeliness of that is very different from the SDGs. But if we do not address climate change in a timely fashion, the most vulnerable populations of every country are going to be condemned to rebuilding constantly every part of the basic infrastructure that will be destroyed by severe events. And they will never be able to pursue the SDGs because they will be in rebuild constantly. So And I just think that that's such a social injustice, because it means if we don't arrest climate change, we would be condemning these people to extreme poverty forever, because climate change will continue forever. These impacts, we've now baked them into the system. It's not like we're dealing with these impacts now or over this decade or until 2050. No, we have baked them into the system forever. And I just can't live with, on my conscience that I didn't do everything that I could to change or to protect these people from the absolutely unbearable scenario that they may never be able to get out of poverty.
Thank you, Christiana. And hearing you speak with that integrity and also referencing the Paris Agreement and the SDGs prompts me to ask, do you feel the world changed in 2015 when you and others brokered these two sets of agreements culminating in Paris at the end of the year?
I do think that the world, the world changes constantly, right? So I don't think in that sense that it is completely unique in terms of changing the world. What I do think was unique is the capacity, the collective capacity of humankind who came together there, represented by the people who were there, to come to a global agreement that many of us, me included, had thought a decade before was completely impossible. In fact, 6 years before, right? And so I never told anyone until I left the Secretariat, but I have been rather public now in my TED Talk, and been very public that the first time that I was interviewed by a journalist did after Copenhagen, when I took over the mess, right? Because basically I got a mandate, pick up the pieces and see what you can do with it, but nobody really thought that anything serious could be done with it. I really thought I was as despondent about Copenhagen as everybody else. Every one of us who were in Copenhagen, and many people who were not in Copenhagen, who read about Copenhagen or who had many hopes for Copenhagen, high hopes for Copenhagen, we were just absolutely despondent, and we were destroyed. Our hopes were in the gutter. There was just such a bad mood on climate change. And when I took over the Secretariat, the first press conference, a journalist asked me, do you think that a global agreement would ever be possible? And I said, not in my lifetime. Because that represented the feeling that we all shared. I don't think I was the only one that answered that. I think everybody would have answered exactly in the same way. What was fascinating for me is that as I uttered that sentence, that was the wake-up call for me, because it made me question my answer. Was that the answer that I could live with? Mm-hmm. It was the answer that I was experiencing, but was that an answer that I could live with? And definitely not. I could not live with that reality. And I knew that I had to change that reality, if you will. So over 6 years, we did, an extraordinary amount of work. Thousands and thousands of people worked on that. But yes, I think that 2015 was unique in that it took a global process that was completely destroyed and proved that you can reconstruct. And you can reconstruct trust, and you can reconstruct a logic that is very different from the one that you had. And you can reconstruct a pathway forward, and you can reconstruct hope. And I think, that we have to do that constantly. You can't sort of work for 6 years and then reconstruct hope every 6 years. Honestly, we have to reconstruct hope every single day, right? Because every day there's something that happens that gives you evidence, negative evidence about yourself or about, your neighbor or mankind in general, or a country that has just come out of election cycle or whatever. And you can't give in to that, right? I just have this really innate feeling that we're all here collectively to improve the planet, not to destroy it. We're here to improve it, and we're certainly here to improve the fate of mankind. And as a collective effort, I think if you take the collective average, we have definitely improved, right? We have much less child mortality. We have much less We have much better poverty levels, improved poverty levels. We have better health levels. We have better female health levels. We have better female participation. None of this where it should be, but certainly better. And we are on a path. You have to see this in a long-term trajectory. Are we on a path toward improving ourselves as a society and improving what we do here on the planet? I think we are. But we have to distinguish between, and now that, I live on a tidal river, which is the first time I live on a tidal river, you have to distinguish between the high tide and the low tide, which goes up and down, and the flow of the river. Those are two different things. Every day, you have low tides and you have high tides, but the flow of the river is always the same. The current always flows in the same direction. And if you get despondent because you happen to look right now at the river, at low tide, and you go, this is absolutely dreadful. And you do have evidences of low tides, right? In your life, in your personal life, in your professional life, in your political life, whatever. You do have evidence of that. But you also have evidence of high tides, and you must make an effort to see the direction of the current. And I am very, very trusting that, the current is moving in the right direction, despite the low tides.
Very clear. Wonderful metaphor, particularly as we look at the Thames outside your window. You were at the heart of the Paris Agreement, Christiana, and I wanted to ask for an insider's account. We who were involved to some degree were amazed by the outcome, but you were at the heart of it. And what was it like, and what happened? Why was it a success?
I think it was a success for many reasons, many of which did not have to do with the 2 weeks. And I think, those perhaps on the outside look at those 2 weeks and go, how did that miracle happen? Well, it was a prepared miracle. It was prepared for a long time. Now, and I do, think that many stars aligned. Some stars aligned themselves, and other stars we invited to align. And some of them we had to nudge. But some stars that aligned themselves and that were absolutely, so let's compare where we were in 2009 and where we were in 2015. In that space of time, the cost of renewable energy technology came down 80%, which means that the technical solution for climate change was so much more possible in 2015 than it was in 2009. And the technical solution is a huge part. It's not just the policy, it's not just the politics, it's not just, because the technology determines the economics of it. Is it economically feasible? And I think it's fair to say that a global agreement in 2009 would have been politically beneficial, but was economically questionable, because the cost of renewable energy was still so high that it really, you would not have been able to install solar or wind at a competitive level against fossil fuels. So to force countries to move into an economically questionable situation doesn't make any sense. Whereas in 2015, there was extraordinary evidence for the fact that we already had 40 jurisdictions in which renewable energy was cost competitive, and in fact sometimes even cheaper than fossil fuels. So technology had a huge part to do with it. The other part that was very, very important is that the science continued to evolve. And we had much better evidence, both of the causes but also of the impacts. Painfully, not just the science, but the impacts continued to evolve. And you had many more countries that had been, in the space of those 6 years, negatively impacted and had really raised their awareness about the fact that they also were in the same planet, and that climate change knows no passport, no boundaries, and that there's nobody exempted from it. So that was painful, but was helpful in the sense that there was a more shared experience. in addition to the advance of science. So those things, I think, were outside of our purview. Within our purview were many other things that we intentionally changed. One was the logic that we had before Paris, or rather the logic that we had at Copenhagen, which was then later characterized by many as the top-down approach, which was the world, you start with the global need. How much do you need to reduce emissions in order to come down to some manageable risk? Never to safety, by the way, just to manageable risk. How much do you have to bring emissions down? And then you begin to parse that out. So it's sort of like, baking a cake and then starting to cut up the slices and say, here's yours, here's yours, here's yours, you're responsible for this. Well, it was evident in Copenhagen that that was not going to work. And furthermore, what had also evolved was because so many more countries were having the impacts, there was also the beginnings of, and I think that process is still in its evolution, the beginning of the understanding that while there is historical responsibility on the shoulders of all developed countries, there is future responsibility on the shoulders of all. And that was a very, very new concept, and was helped by the impact, the broad impact that everybody was feeling. That would have been impossible in Copenhagen. That understanding that you have historical responsibility, which nobody denies, but that in addition to, and without denying historical responsibility, there is a shared responsibility to the future. That was also a very intentional paradigm shift that we really injected into the conversation throughout 6 years, because it was clear that we would not be able to reach an agreement only among industrialized nations. For one thing, because it would be politically impossible, but also because it wouldn't solve the problem, because future emissions are coming from the global south. So it was clear, that the agreement that we would have to rebuild and reconstruct was more complex because it had to involve everyone, but that it would have a better impact. So moving from only historical responsibility to historical responsibility plus a shared future and differentiated responsibility was a huge paradigm shift that really needed 6 years to evolve. And hand in hand with that, then came the understanding that this couldn't be a top-down, that this had to be actually a bottom-up. Why? Because one of the huge lessons learned for me from Copenhagen is that if you pit the global need against a national interest, it is invariably the national interest that will win. And that you cannot pit those two things against each other, because it is only human to first be true to your immediate need, your personal, if you want to work at that level, your personal need, your family, your community, your country's need. That is going to come first before the global need. And that's understandable. That's the way we humans work. And so it was a mistake in Copenhagen to pit those two things against each other. So we changed that. That was another paradigm shift, to begin to understand, look, yes, we have a global need, but can we address the global need through the pursuit of national interests without pitting them against each other, but rather seeing one as the pathway toward the other? How do you begin to understand that there is a national interest in pursuing climate change? And that's very evident from the point of view of small island states, right? Because obviously they are, they are very, very vulnerable to sea level rise, and so of course their national interest is for them, but mostly for everybody else to do something on climate change. But it's not so easy to see that from the point of view of fossil fuel exporting countries, or of countries that have an economy that is already at a certain level of development based on fossil fuels, for whom the change would be much more difficult. So it was the work of patience and a lot of very, very patient conversations to bring all of those countries around to understand, and just asking them questions, right? In your sustainable development pathway, where do you see that there could be an overlap between addressing climate change and your national interest? And that takes a long time. It takes a long time to change that paradigm shift, and then for them to finally, the end result of that process was the invitation to all countries to really do their homework and figure out how they could contribute. So that's the result of the INDCs.
Yes.
So the INDCs, right, the intended, the nationally intended contributions are the result of that change of paradigm, where every country did their own analysis from their technical, political, economic, reality, to identify how could they contribute to the global effort, but through their national interests. And that was dramatically different than Copenhagen. So I think that all of these shifts, and then the third, I think that I would add to that, was how do you then pursue a common purpose with a diversity of approaches? Because it was very clear, A, that we couldn't have just industrialized countries are in, developing countries are out, which is the sort of bifurcated approach that you have in the Kyoto Protocol, and that we would have had in a Copenhagen Accord had that gone forward. You couldn't have the bifurcated approach, but it was also clear that there is an extraordinary amount of differences in all of the economies. Every economy is at a different level, and every country has a different set of natural resources. So the reality of every country is unique, and you can't put any country into a straitjacket and expect them to contribute in the same way or at the same speed or at the same scale. So how do you form the unity of purpose, the commonality of purpose, which is decarbonizing, but with a diversity of approaches? And how does that then get put into a framework that is that has environmental integrity? Because it was very clear that the moment that you open up for this diversity of approaches, where everybody contributes at a different pace, different scale, different measures, et cetera, the sum total of that, and we knew that from the beginning, the sum total of that would not meet the global need. It walks in the direction, right? It sets the path, but it does not meet the under 2 degree need. So then we had to think about how do we close that gap. And that's why in the end, and that was the most difficult part in Paris, after all of these pieces had fallen into place, the most difficult thing, and the one that we only landed 24 hours before we finished, was what we call the long-term goal. Which is Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, which is the agreement that we will keep temperature rise from going, keep it well below 2 degrees, and in fact even aspire to 1.5, and that we will be at the balance, because the only way to do that temperature management is to reestablish a ecosystem balance that we used to have that we lost, which is not to emit more greenhouse gases than the planet can naturally absorb. And that is what many people call the zero net, or net zero, or carbon neutrality, or climate neutrality, whatever you want to call it. But it's basically the equation that what gets emitted is not more than what gets absorbed, and that we will be there by the second half of the century. And that is the final destination that gives the Paris Agreement integrity, because it acknowledges that all of the current efforts are insufficient, but it establishes a final destination which addresses climate change in an effective way, and puts in a path of a 5-year review toward that ultimate destination. So it's not very different, from when you travel someplace. You leave, you have a point of departure, you have a path, a road, whatever, and you have a final destination, and that's the way you progress. You can't progress unless you have those three references. You have to know where do you start, you have to know how you're going to move, and you have to know where you end up. If we had only had one of those three pieces, which was the situation that we had in Copenhagen, we would not have been able to have a framework that will accompany us for several decades, and that is not fragile. Despite elections, okay? It's not a fragile framework, because of so much participation, and let me talk about that also, but also because it establishes a path over several decades, and one that is reasonable, one that countries can contribute to, and one that in the end was seen to be to their advantage.
Very clear. Thank you, Christiana. So this will not be derailed by the US context and Mr. Trump. This will not be derailed by other forces. It's inexorable.
I think it's the direction here of travel is irreversible. So I don't think it's going to be derailed for several reasons. Because most countries understand that it is in their interest, right? And thank heavens that we got that piece there. So it is in their interest, and most countries will continue to pursue, and we've seen immediate reactions to the US elections of 47 developing countries saying, well, actually, we're going to increase our ambition, we're going to 100% renewables.
Amazing.
And we've seen China say, no matter what the United States does, we're going toward an ecological civilization, and furthermore, we're going to help the world establish an ecological civilization, right? Good on them. So we will continue to see the movement. And the other reason why it's not going to be delayed is because one of the other things that we did with a lot of effort over those 6 years between 2009 and 2015 is we opened up the space of participation way beyond national governments, and very, very intentionally involved subnational governments, cities, states, regions, provinces, corporations, investors, insurance companies, very important, and the whole civil society. And that, was not the case before Copenhagen. So to open up the space for their participation and to make that a positive conversation, because I remember having been in Copenhagen that the participation, very limited participation that there was of civil society, was a very, very confrontational participation, where civil society came to clobber governments on the head and blame them and put pressure on them. And, when I took over the Secretariat, I said, forget that. That kind of an attitude is not going to take us anywhere. So it was very, very much, and I remember one of the first things I did in the Secretariat was go through all of our literature, everything that was on the web, everything that we had ever written, every speech, everything, and take out any word that was negative. We used to fight climate change. You will never hear me say fight climate change. You will always hear me say address climate change. And you go on down the line, right?
Very good.
And we turned everything to a positive, so that civil society was invited to support governments, to encourage, to provide them with analysis, to help them out, to provide, a basis with which they could work, not to blame them, and not to put them under pressure. So that whole space of what I call radical collaboration, right? And I think that is one of the main contributions of Paris, is that spirit of radical collaboration among everyone, which will continue to bear fruit. And of all of the meetings that I've had over the past month, that is what has really impressed me the most. That people have really, just pulled themselves up from the bootstraps and said, the collaboration that they build toward Paris is now going to be strengthened after Paris. And they will continue to work with each other. And this is not going to be derailed by one government, no matter what the size of the economy is. And people in the United States want to continue, right? So you have cities, you have states, you have civil society in the United States, because they know that it's good for them, so they will continue.
Fantastic. And that brings me on to my next question, which is about what gives you hope. The book I'm trying to write is showcasing some of the best things that are happening around the world. Are there any particular case studies, stories that inspire you? What are you doing now as well?
Well, what gives me hope is precisely, that no matter what happens out there, and no matter what we read in the news, and no matter what events, there is just for me, because and everybody sees the reality they choose, right? So I choose to see the good news and the goodness in humanity. But there's just an extraordinary momentum and groundswell of what I call collective consciousness, and willingness to work on the toughest issue that we've ever faced. And it's really fantastic because we've never done this, right? We have never addressed climate change. But that is not stopping people from, waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning and go, I wonder if we could do the following. And then they call each other and they go, what do you think about this? What do you think? So there is creative thinking going on, and there is, a real commitment to really understand that we can't pass this on to our children, that we have to address this now, and we have to do it in a timely fashion. And so that's what gives me hope. All of these fantastic people, and I don't know how many people I've spoken to since Paris, but even in the past month, who are just absolutely undissuaded, right? They're just going, with what I call stubborn optimism, which is I think is so fantastic, because you have to be stubborn about it, right? You have to be stubborn, because otherwise it gets waylaid with other information. So what am I doing now? So having delivered the Paris Agreement with one little mission in life,
for which many thanks from us all.
So now I have another mission, and I call it Mission 2020. And if there's one thing that I regret about the Paris Agreement, there's only one piece that I regret about that text, and that is that it does not convey a sense of urgency. And that is very important, because contrary to all the other SDGs, there is a physical alarm clock inbuilt into climate change. If we want to maintain the possibility of 1.5 degrees being maximum temperature rise, and not endanger 2 degrees, then we have to get to the maximum point of emissions by 2020 globally, and then begin the descent. If we go beyond 2020 to 2025, 2030, which is where we're headed now, and then begin the descent, then you've closed the window on 1.5. Translation, you are condemning many, many people to leave their countries, to have to migrate forcefully, and to poverty. A scenario that is not one that I want to have on my chest. We already have 60 million displaced people in the world, more than any other time in history. We can't afford to duplicate and triplicate that. And we can't afford to displace people away from their countries and let their countries go underwater. It's just completely unacceptable to me. So we have to get to global peaking to bend the curve of emissions by 2020. Who could that be?
You were talking about peaking emissions at 2020, Christiana.
Peaking emissions. So we have to peak emissions and descend by then to protect the 1.5. So that is my new mission. And it's not in the Paris Agreement, that sense of urgency about what we need to do in the next 4 years. And the reason why it's not there is because it would have killed the agreement. It was, you can only load any boat so much before you sink it, and I think that we managed to load the Paris Agreement to the utmost degree, and it is a very, very ambitious agreement. But if we had forced that sense of urgency into the agreement, we just wouldn't have got it. So it was a difficult choice, because I knew that science demands this, and I certainly knew that social justice and morality demanded. But I had to make a choice, right? I had to choose between getting an agreement that starts us off on the right path and puts us in the right direction and gets everybody on board, without the sense of urgency, and then I knew that we would have to work on the sense of urgency. But that sense of urgency is only a derivative conclusion from the final destination. Because if you understand the final destination, what that means, that balance, we have to start in 2020 in order to get there, okay? It's just that we couldn't make it that in your face, right? So we can put it in writing. So my new mission is called Mission 2020. And it is sharing the sense of urgency and inviting people to understand this, and inviting everyone, governments, subnational governments, national governments, corporations, to begin to address this urgency issue. And I am thoroughly delighted because C40, which is a group of 90 cities, that bring together 1 in every 12 people around the world, have just delivered their Deadline 2020 report.
Great.
Having understood as cities that they, not just them, but all cities have 70% of the emissions already. 70% of global emissions come from cities. So they understand that cities have a huge role to play here. And they have just delivered 2 weeks ago their 2020 Deadline report. That shows that they have that responsibility, and also goes into an analysis of how each of them can actually do this. So, my mission over the next 4 years is to continue to expand the understanding of the 2020 deadline, and make it possible, because we can make anything possible that we dream up, that we want. We are the ones that create the constraints, so we can also remove them.
Christiana Figueres, thank you so very much. We wish you the best of luck with your new mission. We thank you for all you've achieved to date. And it's fantastic to see you in London and to be here. So you'll be working here predominantly, or travelling a lot?
I will be living here in this wonderful city. And I'll be traveling to wherever I need to go to, bring the 2020 message.
Fantastic. And reflecting on the Thames as it's
from
your window. Thank you so very much indeed.